Welcome back to the APIs You Won't Hate podcast. We took a little bit of a summer break. We kind of needed it with everything going on in the world, but I'm back today with Mike and Phil. Guys, how are we doing today?
I'm laying on my back, sipping a cocktail, enjoying the summer sun. It's been one of those summers. I've just soaked it all in. Super non-stressful. I'm doing good. How are you?
I mean, I got hit by a
Nice.
car, but I'm alive, so I can't complain. And
How
Phil, it looks
how
like
did
you're
that
on a
go? What
boat.
happened?
She in Nashville, street laws and like road laws are suggestions, not laws.
Right.
And she ripped through a stop sign, and I ended up on the hood of her car. And it is what it is. It was I rode. I've Strava has me at like 8,000 ish miles since I ever started
Nice.
tracking. So the fact it took me
Yeah.
8,000 miles to get hit is kind of feels like a achievement. I
Yeah,
don't know.
that's pretty impressive. I get like one for every 2,000 miles roughly. It's
That
yeah,
is
it's like
not a
every other
deal I
month.
want. I do not want that deal.
Yeah, well, I don't believe your story because you're suggesting that a car drove through a stop sign. That is only something that bicycles do. All cars abide the law, and all cyclists are anarchist, law-breaking scumbags. So your
Really,
story
yeah.
doesn't hold up to me. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it was only me in the car, so you'll have to take my word for it. And I am an absolute anarchist. Phil, it looks like you're on a boat. How's that going?
I am on a boat. 2 days here. I've been moving around all over the place. Summer's been wild, cycling around all over the place. Still voluntary homeless. Still working on tree stuff. And so I'm in Bath, which is kind of where I'm from. And yeah, 2 days on a boat. It was just an Airbnb that I got a little while ago. For 2 nights, and then I kind of became friends with the dude that owns it, and so now I try and like get on the boat when he's got gaps in Airbnb at a discounted rate. Um, and it's great because it's like semi off grid. It's got a solar panel. I'm floating around. There's got a paddle board that I've been considering getting on for a little while, but it's cold, and if I end up wet, this is like my only outfit that I own, and there's no washing machine, so I'll just be in like river clothes for the next 3 days.
That sounds like it could be a good time nonetheless. So how long are
Yeah,
you
I
there
might just
for? I thought you were in the
naked
Netherlands
paddleboard.
still.
I was in the Netherlands for a while. I just did a crazy bike ride. Me and a gang of bike messengers set off to Switzerland, and then they did some bike messenger championship race, and I shot off through the Alp foothills, through the south of France. Did a bit of Pyrenees action. Nearly had to walk out of the Pyrenees with the bike on my shoulder, but I managed to tie a knot in my bloody inner tube and get out of there. And then through the desert in North Spain to the ferry in Santander, and then got on a ferry home to the UK. So I did like a real fast, like 5 week half of Europe speed lap, wild camping, sleeping in the woods in my tent or in these little huts, showering in, like washing in the river, just being feral, just like catching
No
crawfish with my
kidding.
bare hands, like foraging for fruit and nuts. It was bonkers and really, really fun. But now I'm back in the UK to do tree stuff. So got some
Yeah,
uh,
got it.
got some trees to plant.
How long do you think you'll be there for this time around?
I'm not allowed to leave the Netherlands for more than 3 months, so I have to go back in a couple of weeks, which is fine. Just stock up on brownies and come home again.
Sure. Got to get your baked goods. They're pretty good at that up in Amsterdam there.
Exactly, they're specialists. Something about them just makes them really Moorish.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, it's been, I don't know, 3 months, 2 months since you and I have talked. I think since any of the three of us have talked, as far as I know. So it feels like we've got quite a bit of catching up to do. I'm curious to hear about. I don't know, Matt. Tell me about your summer. Like, what have you been up to? What's life been like? How's work going? What sort of life things have you encountered beyond getting smashed by a Buick at a stop sign?
Oh man, life's been good for the most part. API wise, I am helping lead a roundtable about getting started with Open API at the API specifications conference. Was involved a little bit with the API, the Open API marketing group. Kind of fell off a little bit just because work got little wild. And then outside of that, really kind of lean into photography. We have a local criterium racing for cycling here, and I have a lot of friends who go there, and I was just like, it sounds like a fun thing to do. So I took my camera and ended up building a photography website to kind of show off that kind of stuff. And then otherwise, it's just been work. Trying to keep up with everything Phil's got going on with Stoplight. I mean, every day it looks like he is tweeting out something new, something awesome from Stoplight in the open API world. And then constantly being like, we should do a podcast, and then something getting in the way of us doing a podcast, and then coming back and be like, we should do a podcast. So
yeah, I feel like 90% of our interactions have been like, hey, we should do a podcast soon. Yeah, nothing.
Yeah.
It's hard to get around to it, man. Summer has been wild, and obviously it's hard to do them from a tent, slightly better from a boat, but I've still got my iPhone hanging out the window to try and pick up some satellite beams. Yeah, it has been tricky, but I think it's probably good for all of us to get some adventure in and get some soaking up the sun and doing all those things before we get back to it. And yeah, there is a lot going on in API world. I think there's been some really interesting developments at Stoplight, right? I have gone now, I spent the last 9 months getting elements done, working with the team, kind of overseeing that as the product person, getting to build the best, my idea of a perfect API documentation tool, that does like API reference docs and guides and everything else. Like I've used a bunch of them before. I've recommended, Redoc and these other tools that are pretty good, but being able to plan my perfect tool was so much fun, because I've already had a lot of product oversight over Prism and Spectral, like all the open source tools. And I feel like now I've helped get the perfect tool to complete the 3 pillars. We've got the Studio for designing your open API, so you have to write bloody YAML by hand. We've got Prism, so you can use that mock thing to get feedback. We got Spectral, so you can make even an API style guide, program a bunch of rules about conventions and stuff. And now we finally got the last piece of the puzzle, which is, and you get docs that you don't have to sign up for a website for. So you can just point elements, the basic elements at any open API file, and you just got really pretty docs that do a whole bunch of stuff. And you get try it out for free, which some other people charge you for. So it's been really nice to get that out. It was meant to take 3 months and it took 9. There's a lot of scope creep, and there was a lot of follow-up work to be done afterwards, which the rest of the team have done. I basically got the main releases of elements out, both elements and the dev portal one, which is kind of a front end for a Stoplight project, but you host it somewhere. We got those out, and then I went peace out and went on my little bike ride for 5 weeks. I'm like, I got the next person ready to take over as product. He already had plenty of context on how it works now and does a great job. And just kind of went, you good? You tagged it? You tagged it. Bye. And now I get to work on DevRel, which is what I was doing before, but different, because in the past, DevRel was just a dumping ground for every single task that other teams didn't want to do. It was technical documentation writing and open source issue triage and prioritization and product management of those open source things, and maintaining extensions and integrations with other software and doing all the conference and all the everything else. It was just everything other. And I feel like everyone at the company expected me to do these 10 different things, but then someone else would expect a different 10 things, and someone else would expect a different 10 things. And it just meant I was never really making anyone happy, because they were not seeing me do all the things they thought, but there was just an impossible number of things. And now it's really cool. We've got a really quite focused, this is what developer advocates should be up to. It should be, 50% content production, 15% gathering insight, 25% doing outreach, and 5% helping with documentation, but not writing all of it, because other people can be doing that. And we're hiring a technical writer as well. I think we've already got one, maybe 2. So it's a really focused job of write interesting articles that you want to write about, and help other people learn about it, gather information back from people, use that to feed back into product, and then help make sure docs are awesome, which is something I'm really happy to do. So good changes at Stoplight.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'm curious who was writing your docs before you had a tech writer, if you were only expected to do 5% effort on that.
Yeah, well, that's the new kind of rough breakdown. In the past, I've basically been involved with kind of open sourcing the 3 main open source tools that we have. And so I wrote most of the docs for that, and a few other people from like the growth team kind of helped out. But it was a bit hodgepodge, and whoever got the thing, you know, when we're releasing something, we're like, here's a whole bunch of docs, and then engineers kind of try and keep it up to date, but also engineers aren't necessarily the best people for writing docs. And even if they are really good at it, and even if they are confident enough in their English and their writing skills, they're often very technical and have a lot of that kind of assumed knowledge, right? So they're not writing to the person who is trying to learn what this tool is from scratch. They're putting all sorts of technical stuff in. And so it has been a bit tricky, and it ends up being the docs get a bit out of date until someone goes, hey, this docs doesn't seem right. And then I run over and update it. And that's just all a bit of a mess. So now the product people are helping with docs. We like plan stuff up front a little bit more. So there's already a lot of words written about how stuff should work. And then they can help with docs a little bit. And yeah, having technical writers means that they will focus on that whole thing, like completely re-architect all of the docs and make it a bit less humbly jumbly of just like, here's a lot of really technical stuff, here's some kind of vague stuff, here's some unexplained code samples, like really kind of own it. Because if no one's owning the documentation, then no one is, and you have no idea if it's accurate, correct, useful. Like, which is bad for a company that builds documentation tools. Like, we need to have someone who's focused on making documentation awesome at our company, right?
Yeah. Are your official docs open source as well? Do you accept community contributions on them?
Yeah, they live in the Git repo, and then, you know, they're obviously hosted on Stoplights, so it just kind of passes the markdown out of that. But I don't think when you look at the docs, there's any obvious links that says like, click here to edit in GitHub or whatever.
Sure.
So I think that is something that needs to be added, because yeah, people reading the docs aren't going to know they can contribute unless they kind of open up GitHub and start messing around in there first.
Right. Yeah. I wasn't trying to guilt trip you, but definitely might be an interesting feature to add along there. It's a nice thing to have your user base be able to hold you accountable for things like that when you're able to, certainly. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, something we're trying to do in October is just get people contributing, right? Like Open Source October, Hacktoberfest. We've got a lot of stuff coming for that. Announce plans when they happen. But yeah, we want to get a lot more contributions to docs and to the code. I think I mentioned before, it's a bit of a funny feeling when a company, like a for-profit company, has open source tools. There's often the feeling that that company should do everything all the time, but they are legitimately open source tools. You know, like we use those tools for our paid stuff, and we, you know, add features accordingly based on, you know, prioritization of customer needs. But often there's a feature that somebody really wants that none of our customers has ever mentioned, and we have other stuff to be working on. And it's like, well, we could do this one by not doing this one. How do we pick what to do? One person on GitHub has asked for this thing, and 100 people have asked for this thing. We'll probably do the 100 people thing. So it's really hard to get people to contribute to that open source when there's a company behind it. But that's part of what I'm going to be working on, is kind of making it feel a lot more like a community project, because it really is. We can't possibly do every feature that everyone wants. It would be, you know, bonkers trying. And the same with docs. You know, if you have a question, or if you figured something out, then it would be amazing if you could put that in there so other people don't have to figure out the same thing that you spent an hour figuring out, you know?
Yeah, no doubt. The act of sort of moving a community from being passive to active and sort of owning some contribution and participation usually starts with a few people who are almost equivalent to like early beta tester users of a product, where they're the ones who are willing to be the noisiest and most opinionated and often most helpful in early stages, and kind of activating other people to contribute and be useful is an important speed bump to get over, and one that can be really, really challenging, but is a super valuable thing to get done.
Yeah. We did a bit of a funny thing in the past when people kind of appear, like when those kind of champions appear and they're sending a bunch of pull requests and things like that. We figured it was best to show thanks and make it a bit more of a formal situation. So we ended up hiring a few as kind of freelancers. They're like, you're sending a bunch of pull requests anyway. How about like we throw some money in there? And I do wonder if that potentially might have messed things up. Like, I wonder if I'm not sure if we're going to do that again, because those people were either doing those things as part of their day job, or they were doing them for fun. And then I think we turned it into a job and started like assigning them things that maybe they didn't think was quite as fun. And obviously the less fun bugs and issues and features need to be worked on. But then those people kind of trailed off. I don't know if that's just timing or coincidence or life or COVID or whatever. But there was a couple of people that were happily slinging pull requests, and then we started paying them, and a few months later they've gone. So that might have been a failed experiment.
Yeah, definitely. Incentivizing people is a really tricky game. There's definitely a fair bit of value in just being the open source contributor and like doing things for the good of it. And I could see that turning on its head very quickly of like, oh man, well, now they expect me to be here, and it's a guilt trip waiting for you every time you turn on your IDE.
Right. And I'm meant to be doing X number of hours a week or whatever, as opposed to like, I'm going to sling some stuff when I sling some stuff. So yeah, like if we did do it again, then maybe it would be on just like a per issue basis, just like more like a bounty system. Like, hey, every time you can get a PR done, based on its priority, we'll give you X amount or whatever. No stress, no hassle. We appreciate you. Because the opposite of that is like, obviously it can be weird for a paid company to expect people to do work for free, right? And I don't want to be like taking advantage of anyone. I've seen that done in other places, and it's gross. And like, I'm not going to sit there and say, it will look great on your resume. Think of the exposure, like every jerk, right? Do work for free. It'll be great. Everyone's an unpaid intern. But there is a balance of like, help us help you. Like you want this specifically, and I'm sure some other people do, but it's not a priority for us. Please chip in some time if you can. We'll sling some trees over as a thank you. Right. That has worked in the past. People have been motivated because you offer someone a $10 Amazon gift card. You're like, screw Amazon. But if you say like, oh, I'll put 100 trees, I'll plant 100 trees in the Stoplight forest, or your forest if you have an ecology account, people are like, yeah, that sounds good. That's helpful. And it's the same amount of money, but just less spammy and weird sometimes.
Yeah, it's a cool idea, and it's something that stands out too, right? Like you'll probably not remember what you bought with that $10 gift card, but knowing that somewhere there's a tree stuck in the ground in your name is kind of a cool idea. Okay, so Phil, I have a follow-on question that is related to this, but maybe also a little bit different. Tell me a bit about how you keep tabs on the members of your open source community or the people, your user base, right? Are there tools that are healthy and helpful and valuable to keeping track of who is participating and who you're owing responses to and things like that? That seems like a growing problem that I experience at work. That's something that we are often looking for better ways to manage.
I will turn that question back to you. What do you use?
Yeah. So it's funny because in a past life, when I was building Simple, my startup, we used lots of CRM flavored tools that sort of integrated together to enable us to take care of people as well as possible. And primarily it involved integrations with a chat messaging integration we used on our website called Intercom, which is just like many of those other things you've seen where you get a little chat bubble in the corner and you can talk to a support person. And in the case of a 3-person company, the support person was often me or one of the other two lads that I worked with. But those Intercom had a lot of helpful integrations with Slack, for example. So when we got a new message, we would get a message in Slack saying, hey, go check your inbox. Someone's waiting for you there. And that resulted in a very good turnaround. It also did some maybe slightly creepy-ish things about like collating the information about who was opening that chat with who they probably were in terms of using retargeting pixels and stuff like that to say like, oh, you got a message from this IP address.
Fingerprinting.
Yeah, and we would get like, oh, it's probably Phil. This is their LinkedIn. This is their Twitter. This is what country they're coming from and what browser they're using, which are all very helpful things when providing support, but also maybe a little creepy-ish depending on how you're looking at it. And if it's being used for less above board things, it's not great. But I'm getting sidetracked here. The useful thing that we use Intercom for is that it plugged into Slack. It also plugged into GitHub. So we would track issues in GitHub, and we would be able to annotate and tag issues in GitHub by saying that like this issue is related to this open conversation with a customer. When we close out that issue in GitHub, it would reopen the conversation with that person and say, you should probably message them and let them know that you fixed the problem they were having. Go track them down. And that created sort of a cycle of support that was really helpful. In that case, this is not really open source contributors, but this is like primary users and folks who are relying on new functionality and reliable things to work. In my new role, over in the world of Google Assistant land, we have this sprawling community of users who span IoT and smart devices, smart screens, smart speakers, mobile devices, and web related stuff that all sort of plugs into Assistant in different ways. And it's like really, really challenging to even have a sense of who's interested in what. And so we've been working through figuring that out and trying to come up with ways to also track the places where conversations are happening so that we're not missing them. In our case, we have LinkedIn to listen to, we have GitHub to listen to, we have Stack Overflow, we have several subreddits, several tags on Stack Overflow, and a team of very few superheroes who are charged with paying attention to all these places and helping resolve those things, in addition to like getting things done in their day job, building new features, documenting things, testing out samples and stuff like that. And so there's a problem of scale that we're running into, where it's different from a startup where we had 50 to 100 to 150 to 200 customers that we could predictably understand how much time in the day we were going to need, to like this giant ecosystem of developers where our time doesn't scale as well. So I'm starting to look for tooling that will help. My dream essentially would be to take all of those places and be able to collate them into one inbox that we could track and tag people internally and say like, hey, Phil, this is probably something that you should work on. And Matt, I know you're the expert in this. Maybe you can give them a response, whatever the case may be. We don't have that right now, but I would love something like that.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of software that kind of overlaps and things get a little blurry, because DevRel, especially for like a developer oriented company, kind of bleeds into, obviously it's a bit marketing, it's a bit customer support, it's a bit of a lot of different things, and it ends up being a bit product and a bit of all sorts. So yeah, we've got the usual tools like Intercom and Zendesk, so that support can track who people are and like reach out to them, and we can kind of talk to people in the chat. But when they have questions, that ends up going to the same place as Zendesk. There's all that usual customer support stuff. One thing that we used to have Discourse, the like online forum, and we finally axed that, because that was kind of put together as a kind of dev route. The previous developer evangelist kind of put that together, and they were kind of owning it, but no one else really was. There wasn't really customer support. Like a lot of the company's developers weren't really paying attention, so it's just like a random place where people were asking. We just made a ghost town, and it was quite hard to figure out what to do with that, and thankfully in the end we chose to just axe it and get Discord instead, because the only place for real-time chat where people were asking questions was the APIs You Won't Hate Slack. Like for a while, that felt like Stoplight support and other stuff. And because people were coming in and going, oh, I'll talk to Phil. He knows about Stoplight stuff. We'll ask him that. And that was weird. And we tried to get GitHub discussions going as well, but that's been a bit quiet. That seems more like if you were going to post an issue, now you've just posted a discussion instead, because it's got a question mark on the end. It hasn't really changed drastically how anything works. It's just different issues. So that was a bit of a failed experiment. We tried to say, like, if you want to talk about open source stuff, do it on GitHub discussions. If you want to talk about company stuff, do that on the Discourse, and you might end up getting ignored. Sorry. So fixing all of that and pointing most people towards Discord. We've managed to get a fair few of the team employees. They're on there who occasionally answer questions, but we've also suggested that people employees don't jump in to answer straight away, because that started to foster a bit of people helping each other out. So like if no one's had a response in 24 hours, we'll answer that and make sure they're okay. But we've already seen loads and loads of people just answering each other. Like Mr. T responds to frog face, whatever it is, like they just help each other out. And sometimes it's just like, oh, that's in the docs over here. And sometimes it's like, oh, I've done that before, da, 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 da. And we can keep an eye on all of that stuff and be like, oh, this question's come up a lot. Let's make some docs for that. But we haven't really got too much further into like weird tracking stuff, to a level where I'm actually struggling a little bit to work out who's using our software where. Like I'm having to survey people to be like, who's using Elements in production? We didn't put any creepy tracking pixels in there, and now I don't know. So yeah, we're trying to kind of track usage in a reasonable way without getting all up in everyone's business. Because if it's a self-hosted open source tool, you should be able to do what you want with it without us like emailing you from Salesforce and asking if you want to like upgrade and like upsell you and get weird about it. So like I feel like marketing, growth, support, and DevRel have always had a lot of crossover with what they're trying to do, what they're trying to track, where their source of truth is, and what integrates with what. and DevRel will need to have a bit more of a kind of coherent plan for that. But at the moment, it's just like, hey, let's go chat on Discord, and that's that.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I'd imagine you're subject to similar things, and probably even Matt to an extent, where there's also places where you could probably get information about people who are interested in or have experience with Stoplights tools that are not your forums. For us, it's often like there's this gigantic community of Alexa developers who are really opinionated and have really built some really cool stuff for voice, and they talk on forums related to those things or open issues related to their stuff, or on Twitter in sort of just separate circles that definitely have some overlap. And I think that there's maybe some mission for DevRel to start listening in places wider than just home, and to start paying attention to other parts of the world, which of course is something that you're better at before you join the DevRel team and before you join the company, because you are subject to all of the things. Matt, I wanted to ask you, because I feel like you're largely a champion of community in many different ways, particularly around in-person events. But as a developer who's often subject to using tools that are built by companies, like, how would you qualify, maybe highlight some of the better experiences you've had as a member of a developer community and interacting with other people who are on potentially the user side of whatever it may be?
It's really hard because I think the line that companies have to toe is really thin between being a really good steward of a community and then hijacking the community for their personal gain. We talk about Stoplight a lot on here. So far, I feel like they're probably one of the better ones, where it's like they are active in the communities. People like Phil and Mark and other people, you see them at events, you see them on Twitter, you see them in Slack channels, Discord channels. They're out there actively helping without trying to make it sound like, without really pushing their product in a way of like, Stoplight is the one true tool to use in this space. I feel like that's the hardest line to follow when you're a company doing this. And I feel like Stoplight does it really well. Postman does it pretty well too. They are definitely doing a lot of different things than Stoplight, but they are definitely kind of positioning themselves to be that same kind of, in terms of testing and developer sharing experience, is kind of where they really fit in well. But they are good ones to look at. I don't really have an example of any kind of company that has hijacked an open source project and kind of taken it over, but I don't think you would have to look terribly far to do that, to find an example. But yeah, it's tricky. So if you're a company looking to do that, you don't really have to look all that far to get good examples, because you just have, in our community, we have Stoplight, we have Postman, and they're both doing excellent things.
Yeah. One thing that we don't often really get to talk about directly, but I feel like we're all subject to, is there's also this notion of, like, in any developer community, you're subject to kind of the influencers in that world who may or may not even be tied to the product that you're using. And I feel like I've seen life cycles of those folks where they start out by being someone who is like very outwardly helpful and giving back to the community by just offering up their knowledge. And here's what I know, here's what you can do, here's how you solve that problem, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually they build a following, and sometimes it takes like kind of a dirty story arc of like, let me produce a bunch of readiness content and learning content around Laravel, Stoplight, React, whatever it is. And then as they start to get more and more attention, the tweets get less and less useful, and it becomes like, here's 10 things every React developer needs to know. And then eventually it just becomes platitudes about being positive and, things that are just sort of clickbait.
Buy my
on
book,
Twitter.
buy my course, like,
yeah.
God, I'll dog on the Laravel community for a second, because they just had their LaraCon conference and lots of good talks, lots of good conference, but like every start of a lot of people's talks and end of everyone's talks was, I have a book about this topic, or I have a course about this topic. And I am not one to hate on people doing side projects, side hustles. I mean, that is how the community gets better, is by pushing content. But it was just like, so in your face, so just it almost felt like a cash grab in a way.
Yeah.
Which kind of sullied the conference a little bit, because I was just like, all right, like you're gonna get up, you're gonna talk about security, which is a great topic, and we need to be talking about security. And I know you have a book because I follow you on Twitter. I don't need to be reminded of it 5 times in your talk, like at the beginning,
rough.
the 20% mark, the 4%, the 40% mark, and I was just like, all right, let's turn it down a little bit. But
yeah, there's a fine line between marketing content and like, I'm going to talk about a bunch of stuff that's interesting and useful in isolation. Like this is a standalone talk that has content. And then if you would like more on this topic, I have done a book. Here's a discount code. Like I used to put that at the end of my thing, but it wouldn't. I'm not just sitting there trying to sell you the book for 40 minutes. Like that's a rough one. And then especially if everyone's doing that, that's a tricky one. You do kind of want a diversity of guests, like different people talking about different things. Some people maybe from a company doing DevRel for their company's tooling. Some people doing something, maybe they've got a book. I mean, when speakers aren't paid, that is what you end up getting, is that you are getting people who have a reason for doing this that's more than just exposure. Right. But maybe that's kind of part of the solution. You could pay some of your speakers a little bit so that you don't just get the ones that want to make money from the talk.
There's an inverted priority sort of there. Once you start being a helpful person in the community, you go from being like, I needed to know this stuff to learn, to being like, oh, now I'm giving away all of my time for free and there's no incentive to continue to do that. And I hope that some tools that are becoming available, like GitHub sponsors and those things, are starting to help bend that. But I also feel like there's a influencer effect there too, where it's really just the folks who've made a giant following for themselves, who may or may not be continually providing direct value, that kind of get the help there. With that being said, there's a number of people that I sponsor on GitHub that I think continue to be shining stars in the community, and I hope are able to stay that way. So all that being said, I feel like we've got a lot more to say here, and maybe this would make for a good follow-on topic for us in the future for the podcast, even though it strays a bit away from maybe strict APIs stuff. A lot of designing and building APIs has to do with building an effective community and interacting with the open source world, and even in some cases not strictly open source communities that help to influence and build a product. So all that being said, I think we'll probably end up revisiting this one again. I'm really glad that we had some time to catch up, Matt and Phil, and I hope that it's not 3 months before we get to talk again. And in fact, before we get off the phone, I'm going to have calendar invites on both of your calendars so that we can have another podcasting date before long.
That's awesome. I like our podcasting dates, and I've got a fancy new microphone. I'm going to be joining the Stoplight podcast to do stuff. So Bossman sent me a fancy, Shure M7 or something. So it's not just going to be like dangly AirPods and whatever nonsense I've got with me at the time. We might actually finally get this to be almost professional, kind of somehow-ish.
I'm thrilled to hear it. Cool. Well, until next time, this is APIs You Won't Hate. I'm Mike for Matt and Phil. We'll be back in a few weeks.
See y'all later.
Cheers.